one of the first. So we're really excited to have the ability to speak directly with someone from Amsterdam today. And then we'll be talking also with someone from Nanaimo. So we've got speakers from 2 of the regions that have been implementing the Doughnut, and also from Copenhagen, which followed Amsterdam. So other communities are picking it up though. Portland, Philadelphia, and even Costa Rica is looking at how to apply the Doughnut to build a resilient recovery. So it's something that's really being talked about across regions around the world, and it's becoming a framework to really help bring together communities. It's important to recognize here in Victoria, we already have a lot of initiatives underway around things like One Planet Saanich, the circular economy, Synergy's green circular economy incubator, business programs, all sorts of initiatives in the region. And the Community Social Planning Council has been doing work on bringing together social metrics in transportation and climate action. So lots of activity, but what this does give us is a framework to really start to gel around how to talk about the social and the environmental, and then look at those initiatives within that framework. So it's not a new or different way of doing it. It's really a higher level, a compass really for continuing to do this work, but in a more focused way. So I'll move into the next slide. So introducing our speakers today, Andrew Fanning is from Amsterdam and has been part of those sort of early initiatives around implementing it at the municipal level from the Doughnut Economics Lab in Amsterdam. And he's really been looking at how they can use the Doughnut methodologically in the Action Lab and iteratively. And his research has been published in leading scientific journals, and he shares the ideas in a lot of settings. So we're really excited to have Andrew here today to speak to both the why and the how of their using the Doughnut in Amsterdam. Julia Lipton from Copenhagen is going to speak to the city portrait perspective of implementing the Doughnut in the in municipalities and regions with the C40. And the city portrait presents city life through the 4 lenses: social, ecological, local, and global, so that you get those externalities and internal implications of how our economy is working in a real circular economy perspective. And finally, Ben Gieselbrecht is from Nanaimo, and recently Nanaimo adopted the Doughnut as an approach and became the first Canadian city to implement Doughnut economics as an approach, as an economic model for their region. Ben is a city councillor with Nanaimo Regional District and an advocate of environmental sustainability and an economy that works for everyone. And he's been passionate about circular economy initiatives and has been spearheading the Doughnut economy. And I think we can move to the first speaker.
Great. Yeah, Andrew, if you'd like to share your screen, we can get started. Really looking forward to this panel.
Sure. Give me 1 second. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be a part. I'm just going to share my screen, which should work. Can I get a thumbs up from Diana, perhaps, to show that
we can
works?
see your slides.
Excellent. Okay, and I really have to say that the spirit of this event is exactly what we love to be a part of at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. So it's exploring the concepts of Doughnut economics to see if they provide a useful frame fit for your context. So I love what you said there, Diana. And if it fits, great. If not, totally fine, as we see ourselves as part of this wider movement of change makers, aiming for the same vision of a world where people and planet thrive in balance. So I'd like to introduce some of the concepts of Doughnut economics, and then I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers and the discussion that follows. And I'd like to begin by recognizing that the 21st century has begun with multiple crises. So from the financial meltdown in 2008, to the era of climate and ecological breakdown, to the enduring COVID lockdown and global health pandemic that we're all experiencing. And the impacts of these crises are heightened by inequalities of age, of race, of gender, and of wealth. And together, these crises are repeatedly just telling us that we're interconnected with each other as well as with the rest of the living world. And that the systemic shocks that we've been experiencing this century largely arise out of the systems that we have inherited from the 20th century. And these 20th century economic systems have been created to expect and demand and to depend upon endless expansion. So we get endless expansion in finance, and there's a subprime mortgage bubble that inflates until it bursts, or endless expansion in economic activity fueled by fossil fuels, and we destabilize the climate, or endless expansion in humanity into the last kind of untouched wildlife areas, coupled with nonstop air travel, and we create all the conditions necessary for a global health pandemic. So we need to reimagine what it means to achieve human prosperity in the 21st century, with a vision that doesn't include endless expansion everywhere. And so we offer a donut. Just as Diana said perfectly, we think of it as a compass for the 21st century that aims to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So the goal is to leave no one in the hole, falling short on the essentials of life, like food or water, sanitation, other social priorities, all of which have been drawn from the social priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they've already been agreed by all of the world's governments. So get everybody over that social foundation and into the green ring, but simultaneously don't overshoot the ecological ceiling, because that means that we're generating excessive pressure where we create climate change or destroy ecosystems and the critical biodiversity that they house. And these 9 planetary boundaries are what Earth system scientists say maintain the delicate balance of the planet. So if we can live in this donut, then we believe that suddenly humanity's aim isn't endless expansion. It's about thriving in balance. And if our challenge, of course, is to achieve that vision, then right now we are far from achieving it. So billions of people currently aren't meeting their essential needs, and they live in cities and nations both rich and poor, while simultaneously we're overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. So we need systems and an economy that can actually get back within the donut from both sides at the same time. And that's never been done before. It needs new visions and new policies. And it's our generational challenge, because the last century's systems weren't designed for this. So this is the global donut. But of course, how do we do it? How do we take this global concept of the donut and translate it down to smaller scales where policymaking actually occurs, like nations or cities? Well, I was a part of a study at the University of Leeds where we looked at more than 150 nations. And let's look at 4 countries across the range. So with a level of economic activity of just $1,000 per capita per year, Malawi is massively falling short on meeting people's essential needs, but they're not exceeding any of the ecological indicators that we've measured. So then we have Colombia or China, who are partly falling short and already in overshoot. So they've got this double whammy we see at the global level of having to meet people's needs while simultaneously getting back within. And then we have Canada, which is actually my nation of birth. It's where we are here today, just doing relatively well in terms of social performance based on this international standard, of course. Not saying that Canada is perfect, but internationally does quite well, but just massively overshooting the pressure on the planet. And by the way, we see this big red overshoot across virtually all high-income nations. So here is more than 100 nations, and the goal once again is to get into the donut. But as you can see, not a single country can put up its hand and say that it's there. So we can think of the world's lowest income countries like Malawi, which are very far from meeting their people's needs, but that are placing very little pressure on the planet. How can they take a journey into the donut? Or we can think of emerging economies like China. How do they redesign, look for new policies and a new vision that has also never been traveled before? And then we can, of course, think of high-income countries like Canada, who are also, who essentially just really need to undertake an unprecedented transformation as well, meeting the needs of all people while simultaneously and massively reducing resources to get back within planetary boundaries. So that's never been done. It's a new journey that requires new ambition and new policies. So in short, from the perspective of the donut, we are all developing countries now. And we need to remember that, of course, these nations aren't living totally separate realities. Their stories are deeply interconnected through history, through power, through a history of colonialism, military power, current relations of debt and trade rules, resource extraction, and the impacts of climate change. So these results show that humanity has entered this unprecedented era that demands change and transformation within all countries, but also, of course, between them. So how do we get into the donut from there? We propose two big fundamental dynamics that need to transform in order to create economies that are regenerative by design and distributed by design. So we've inherited economies from the 20th century that are degenerative. They take resources, they make stuff out of them, use them for a little bit, and then throw them away. And this linear model is, of course, running down Earth's life-supporting systems, and we need to bend those curves back. This is the fundamental basis of circular economies, to create regenerative economies where resources are used again and again with much more care and more creativity and more collectively. So we need to transform from degenerative to regenerative, but we also need to transform from being centralizing and divisive with opportunity and value being held in the hands of just a few, to being much more distributive in terms of sharing that same opportunity and value much more equally with all who co-created. So I'm just going to go through a few quick examples of those based on the housing sector to take a look at what regenerative and distributive could look like in practice. So in Amsterdam, the city of Bijkslotterham is a circular construction lab, which is it's arisen in part because of the city's strategy that aims to cut the use of new materials in half by 2030 and be fully circular by 2050. Or we can look at Portland, which has legislation that requires houses to be deconstructed to salvage and reuse materials rather than being demolished for the landfill. And this requirement has recently been updated in 2020, and it has helped to shift norms in the city. Or if we can think distributed by design, the designer Alejandro Aravena builds half houses that allow families to purchase a home with the minimum requirements for shelter that can then be filled in incrementally, and it dramatically reduces the costs of home ownership. And finally, moving away from private ownership, in Vienna, 60% of residents actually live in housing that is either owned directly by the city or by local cooperatives subsidized by the city, which makes Vienna one of the most livable major cities in the world. And of course, this is the housing sector, so the businesses and enterprises engaged in that sector need to not only transform the design of their products and services, but also transform their own business models in order to be regenerative and distributive themselves. So we have these two big dynamics that need transforming, but how do we then take into account the local context and the history that we were speaking about, that Diana mentioned at the beginning, that makes each place unique, right? And that's a question we've been exploring for cities, where we created a framework that you can almost think of as unrolling the donut in order to free up space so that we have, space to envision the safe and just future that we want. And when that space is created, then we can start mapping different initiatives and different opportunities onto it. And it's based on a core question, which we ask every ambitious 21st century city or place, and which I invite you to consider here for the Greater Victoria region this morning. So how can Greater Victoria become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And wrapped up in there are four fundamental questions, which I'll go through very briefly. So first of all, how can all the people of Victoria thrive? So all people need food or water, care, and a voice to thrive, but the ways in which people satisfy those needs varies enormously from place to place. So how do we ensure that everyone is healthy, connected, enabled, and empowered here? Second, how can Victoria thrive within its natural habitat? So where on this planet is Victoria? And which biome is it a part of? Or how do healthy ecosystems cleanse and cool the air, or house biodiversity, or store carbon, or cycle water? And how can the city look to the surrounding healthy ecosystems and likewise aim to match or exceed those same ecosystem functions. So these two questions set out the local aspirations, like thriving people in a thriving place. But how can we know that every city, of course, is a part of a larger whole? So how can Victoria respect the health of the whole planet? So how does the food or the clothing or the electronics, how are those products that are consumed within the city generate environmental burdens both at home as well as abroad through the materials embodied within them and the wastes that are emitted to produce or dispose of them? And what can be done to reduce those environmental footprints in order to live within the means of the living planet? And finally, how can Victoria respect the well-being of all people? So again, consider the food, the clothing, the electronics, and other materials that flow through a city, except now think of the people who work to grow the food or sew the clothes or mine or assemble or ship or deliver the products. And what are their labor conditions? And how do these interconnections with global supply chains affect their community? So we offer these questions to ambitious cities. It's a lot to take on and it can look complex, but they underpin so many of the challenges and the opportunities that cities often face. And the questions don't just go away if we don't confront them. And what we found is that actually sitting down with these questions can be an enriching process for imagining the impacts of policies from a holistic perspective. For example, if we imagine redesigning Victoria's food future, we can use the four lenses of the portrait to map city targets across the four lenses, or to celebrate actions and initiatives that are already underway, or to flag key challenges and to highlight key new initiatives that can be undertaken. And crucially, of course, is to highlight the interconnections across these so that we can get a bigger picture of the whole. Of course, this is just a made-up example, and Julia will be speaking to the experience of applying the portrait in practice. So we've created this city portrait methodology together with our partners, C40, Circle Economy, and Biomimicry 3.8. And Amsterdam was the first to publish theirs in April 2020, right at the hardest moment of the first wave of the coronavirus pandemic. And by publishing it, they started a process of what we see as peer-to-peer inspiration, which is incredibly powerful. So there was traction in the media worldwide on how they were using a new vision to emerge from this emergency. Then we published a methodology of how we created this portrait just a few months later, making it freely available for others to pick up and adapt. And now there are cities all over the world who are picking it up, following the lead of Amsterdam and committing to creating their own portraits adapted to their needs and priorities. So we are convinced actually that city processes will have far greater traction when initiated by city planners together with communities and action networks. So I wanted to raise another example of what happened in Amsterdam, is that a group of local change makers from civil society, from academics, businesses, social enterprises, and others, they self-organized to create the Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition in parallel to the city-led initiative, which provides a space for holding the city to account. It's not directly related to the city. And here's another example where peer-to-peer inspiration comes in, is there are now Doughnut action networks self-organizing worldwide, once again led by Amsterdam's experience. And furthermore, these networks have now gotten together with one another in a Slack group and meeting regularly with monthly meetings to share and discuss shared experiences and challenges. So I've been focusing on city initiatives here today, but I just want to say that we see this energy across communities, across governments, businesses, and other people working across different themes. And we at DEAL exist to make this visible. So we launched the DEAL community platform in September last year as a place to connect and share and inspire and get inspired from people who want to put doughnut economics into practice. And since then, members have been creating Creative Commons tools, they've been hosting events, they've been sharing stories of exactly that, putting doughnut economics into practice. So my final point is actually just to reflect on a creative tension that we're seeing as we apply the concepts of doughnut economics in practice. And it's around opening up the core concepts of donut economics to be available to use and adapt for all, and also balancing that openness with ensuring the integrity in how the concepts are put into practice. And this is especially important in the field of business, where the donut's transformative potential we see it as most at risk of being misused or watered down. So as a result, we've created guidance for businesses on our platform, and we're carefully designing a strategic approach describing the conditions under which businesses can engage with the donut. And in the meanwhile, until we're ready to publish our business policy, we currently have this position that businesses can use the donut as a tool for internal reflection and not as a tool in public-facing communications, and that for-profit organizations currently cannot launch or lead donut-related initiatives. But at the same time, we're in the process of recruiting a business and enterprise lead in the coming months to lead and further develop this work. So I just wanted to flag it now to show that it's a very active area for us, and we're working hard to balance that openness and integrity question. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers and the rest of this event. So thanks, and back over to you, Diana.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And now we're moving to Julia Lipton, who's Head of Innovation at C40 Cities. Julia.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Andrew, for that amazing presentation. I'm just trying to share my screen. I don't know how you get straight onto that slide like so smoothly like that. You're gonna have to teach me how to do that. Thank you. You can hear me fine, can't you?
Yeah, that's great.
Perfect. So, Diana, I'm not in fact from Copenhagen. I am from Sydney, and this is a picture from Sydney, my hometown. And I also really wanted to call out the acknowledgement and the importance of our First Nations people. Australia similarly has a deep connection to land and country, and we always need to respect our elders past and present. But yeah, I'm not from Copenhagen. I live in Copenhagen, so it is where I live, work and play. And following Andrew's amazing presentation of the economics of the donut and how wonderful it is, as Diana says, bringing together the ecological with the social, I'm going to take it a little bit further, and I've been asked to talk about why C40 as a network of megacities around the world is using this framework as the next frontier of climate action in our cities. And we've been collaborating with Doughnut Economics Action Lab together with Circular Economy on the development of these tools to really make them tangible and useful at the city level, but acknowledging that there's such a diversity in the room today for Greater Victoria, is that in this space, it's not just about cities leading, it's about working together with your communities, with your businesses and individuals to really realize the transformation that needs to happen. So I really look forward to hearing from Ben, who's the real person that's making the change happen in Nanaimo. And yeah, I'll start with that as an introduction. So for those of you that don't know C40, we're in fact a network of 97 cities. Don't get me into why we don't rebrand every time we get a new city, but we are 97 of the world's largest cities in the world. So therefore we represent a significant contribution of people in the world, 700 million, as well as GDP, which is what we've been beholden to for the last however many decades as the key driver of economic prosperity. But that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, is moving away from that. Vancouver is one of our members, but as I was saying, is that the importance of our cities to be really governing for the people and working with business on the ground is absolutely critical. We basically work on a basis of peer-to-peer sharing. So as Andrew said, we release resources out to more than just the network. We don't we build peer-to-peer knowledge, but then share it out openly as a principle. So all the tools and resources that we're talking here today are available online, although we've still got plenty of work to do. So why are we using Doughnut economics? Essentially, because cities drive consumption. And while they can't necessarily govern the global economy per se, as the centers of urban demand and consumption, there is a real opportunity to influence way beyond the city boundary. And essentially home to currently 55% of the world's population, but that's growing. The rapid movement of people to cities for opportunity, for jobs, for prosperity, but also for lifestyle is really growing our urban centers. And right at the moment, it's about turning people from what otherwise might be producers on the land to consumers. And this is something that we really need to address. And we welcome Doughnut economics as a concept of redefining what that economic prosperity looks like. So consumption drives greenhouse gas emissions. And when we did a study, before COVID, BC, I forget what year it was now, but it turns out that our consumption-based emissions in cities is greater, almost 2/3 that of the production-based emissions. So those emissions that are in boundary, generally energy, networks, buildings, transport, those emissions that cities generally control in terms of policy is a smaller proportion than those that are driven by our consumption, the decisions of goods and services that are consumed in the city, produced elsewhere. So this is a real problem, because when you put that all together, that's 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a significant opportunity for cities to influence the climate change agenda. More bad news is that consumption emissions left unabated will increase or almost nearly double by 2050. So that is kind of scary stuff, because while, actually I thought I had a slide in between that, but the reason why they're increasing is because as we increase in our income, our greenhouse gas emissions increase. So while we're striving for a bigger house and a bigger car on a bigger property and more stuff that makes us a better person, because we've been conditioned for so long to say that we need things that we probably don't need, our greenhouse gas emissions increase in line with GDP and generally income. And the problem with this is that there is another study that said that once you get over, I think it was 70,000 annual income for the general family, you provide your basic social needs, as Andrew was talking about, but you don't exponentially increase with all your 10% salary increase time, that your happiness doesn't increase. In fact, what we're seeing come into societies is obesity, depression, anxiety, all these things that are associated with the more wealthy levels of living. So we're not necessarily getting happier as we move up this trajectory of income and GDP growth. So high income cities need to act faster. And that's in order to stay with the science-based target of 1.5 degrees. So if we're increasing by 2050, we need a reduction of 80% by 2050 to stay within a 1.5 degree trajectory, which is what we need to be safe for all nations of the world, particularly those that are going to be most impacted by climate change. And the high income cities of the world need to decrease their consumption by 2/3 by 2030. So that's really quite daunting, but it's not cities alone. So this is the point that I made beforehand. It's cities in collaboration with communities and business, but it's also with national governments, who are absolutely critical as policy change makers on the national economic level. But at the end of the day, as these centers of urban consumption that are designed as to how we live, work and play in the city, there's such a huge opportunity for our cities to influence this agenda of consumption-based emissions. But if you present all this data and information and daunting statistics as to the trajectory that we're on, this is what happens. People just sort of say, oh, well, I don't want to change. People don't like change fundamentally, but we are going through astronomical change, because what happens after that is this. As Andrew was saying, the COVID crisis is essentially one of the many reasons is the encroachment that we're making onto natural habitats, which is increasing the viruses that can jump between animals and humans. But now our cities are in crisis and they're dealing with the immediate jobs, economic and health crisis, which is absolutely immediate and paramount, of course. But in times of crisis, there's an opportunity for change. And I think the key thing is the opportunity for cities to create a positive narrative around the transformation that's happening in our cities currently, and how we can redefine what a good life is in this. In lockdown, we've seen a lot of people in my circles start to bake bread, but also really miss the things that are most important in life, connecting with your family and friends more than they have been about shopping or even travel. People have really embraced the fact that it's okay to stay put out of the benefit of the greater good and solidarity, whether that's within their community or in global solidarity with the rest of the world. We need to foster that positive narrative around being better humans rather than a more individualistic approach to things. So this is work that's been done by Climate Outreach about the importance of really building a better, resilient narrative in what is going to be increasingly uncertain times that we live through. Another really wonderful report to frame how we redefine a good life and what a sustainable lifestyle looks like is the Cambridge Sustainability Commission's report on scaling behaviour change. So, and this is where a sustainable lifestyle is a cluster of habits and patterns of behaviour embedded in a society and facilitated by institutions, norms and infrastructure that frame our individual choices in order to minimise our use of the natural resources and generation of wastes while supporting fairness and prosperity for all. I really love that quote because it basically says why we're using the donut, because it's a holistic systems approach to how cities adapt and change in this to create that. Another slide to show you the interplay. So a lot of people say, but you can't tell people how to live their lives. And indeed, that's not what we're suggesting, that cities or governments are starting to tell people that you must eat this or you must do that or whatever else. Of course, people have free will. But that free will is governed by not only a set of values and beliefs within the individual, but the social norms and the narratives that guide our lifestyle and the influences of family, culture, religion, and friends. So we need to acknowledge that as cities, as the places where people live, work, and play, there's a real opportunity, particularly for cities, to build these positive norms and narratives around what a sustainable lifestyle looks like. But that alone is not enough. So you also need the environment, the infrastructure, and the policies that really incentivize and indeed make a 1.5 degree lifestyle or a sustainable lifestyle not only easy and affordable, but attractive. And that is the critical thing, is we need to make it something that we all actually are drawn to rather than being a sacrifice. And that's the real trick and the beauty of the donut. So bringing you back to Andrew's 4-part question that we've been asking our most ambitious 21st century cities. How can our city be home to a thriving people and a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? It's a big philosophical question, but it actually comes down to the simplicity of our cities and what they've been doing for many years already. So healthy, connected, empowered, and enabled people that have access to good, clean air, water, and land, as in affordable housing and the basic social needs that you need, but within planetary boundaries. We asked this fundamental question to the cities that Andrew mentioned, and it was really enlightening to the fact that while they are big questions, that people were really genuinely wanting to see the transformation and be part of the solution. The energy that was in the room, in the acknowledgement that there was a lot of good stuff happening in the city, but indeed not so good things. It's essentially the portrait portrays the good, bad, and the ugly of the city and starts a conversation about what that transformation looks like. And it's really genuinely exciting from my perspective, and the people in the room loved it. So this is just stealing Andrew's slide. The thing that I would like to really emphasize, which Andrew said as well, this is a framework. It's not a whole new thing, and it encompasses so much of what cities are doing already. So in terms of how your city can thrive within its natural habitat, it's things like climate risk, adaptation, nature-based services, air quality. Cities have been working on this for some time already. On the respect of the whole planet, it's a mitigation strategy, but also looking at biodiversity and this extension of how the goods and services that we consume impact on places elsewhere. How the people of the city can thrive is family sustaining jobs, inclusivity, equity, and resilience. And finally, on the global social lens, it is about global equity, solidarity, and respect. And that's probably something that we haven't really thought about before as being very place-driven, locally driven people. But it's really important as we recognize how interconnected we are with the rest of the world, which has really come to a forefront with COVID-19, is that our actions and the way that we act has implications elsewhere. So as Andrew said, there is a tool that's already available that can get down to more policy level. So what this is like the 4 lenses, but with little word prompts. I don't expect you to be able to read the tiny little words on the page. But if you put a policy or a idea that you had in the middle of where the diamond is, you can test it across those 4 lenses. And what we really find amazing is that it starts this dialogue of collaboration. People that work in mitigation and us talking to people in adaptation, but also social and environmental. So it's a really great tool for unlocking participation beyond the city boundaries. So regionally, geographically, but also policy people with community and business leaders. Just a bit more of a practical thing with an example of Paris's. So the first thing really from a consumption-based emissions perspective, because you can start with the donut, it's so big. What we recommend people to do is to start looking at where the major consumptive sectors or the impact from the city generated locally, where that impacts globally, and start engaging and collaborating where that greatest impact is. But always focus on the benefits. It's got to be valuable to people. It's got to be meaningful to the people. Otherwise, you won't get that kind of traction. And of course, in this economic downturn that we're facing, jobs is critical, and acknowledging that there will be disruption and volatility as we transform our cities, that a just transition is critical to think about as you're starting to embark on these conversations. And that is it from me. I hope I kept to time. Thank you, Diana.
You did, fantastic. Wow, never been so on schedule. Something with all this technology. Thank you so much, that was fantastic. I really appreciate the spotlighting that local to global, because I think with a model like this, the instinct can be a little bit of sort of that closed nationalism approach and that sort of shutting down a little bit that local to global. So that concept of respect and internationalism in the model, I think, is really important. We've seen that with COVID, particularly with inequity in access to vaccines, that there isn't room in the social part of the donut to not have that local to global as well. So really appreciate that. And we'll move now to Ben Giselbrecht to speak about how it's happening in Nanaimo.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you for the awesome presentations. And yeah, I'll speak a little bit to Nanaimo's experience with adopting the donut. And I'm just going to share my screen here. Slideshow. Okay, is that coming up for everyone?
We can see your desktop, but not the slideshow. I think you might be sharing the wrong window.
Okay. Try this one. Is that showing up?
Yeah, second time's a charm.
Perfect. Great. So Nanaimo, we adopted the Doughnut as a guiding framework for all our city planning last December. And the motion was to adopt the model as a cohesive vision for all city initiatives and planning processes, and then to engage in the city portrait for Nanaimo. And this motion came at a critical time, maybe a little tighter timeline than we would have ideally had, given that our city was in the process of doing an official community plan update, which happens every 10 years. And we were mobilizing significant resources for public engagement and planning to look at the larger city policies and land use plans for the next 20 years. And so in December, we had this motion, and it was a split vote on our council. But now I think most folks are up to speed, and we're well on our way now for implementing this. So this is a quick look at our model to start with. It's a very rough draft, but it all starts with asking the question, to be a city, a thriving city that respects the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet. And what really kicked off the conversation of why we would consider in Nanaimo for adopting the Doughnut was we were really looking for a framework that could clearly tell the story of what we were trying to achieve as a city, both externally to the community, but also something that could provide some integration across our departments and help us organize internally to really focus on meeting the objectives that we've set out to do and be very outcome focused. So we were inspired by Amsterdam, and they've got all these wonderful planning photos of just how organized and their planning system is underneath the framework. And when we were initially looking at sustainability frameworks for our environmental policies, but as all communities are experiencing, on the island, there's significant social issues, and equity is a critical piece. And what we found was that the Doughnut model was it was an elegant way of integrating the environmental and the social, taking sort of, making sure that we're not taking too many of the Earth's resources, and then looking at how we can share them equitably. So the process starts when you adopt the Doughnut, is to enter into the city portrait process. And this process has been very well laid out by the City of Amsterdam, C40 Cities, and the Doughnut Economics Lab. And there's a whole ton of resources that can be used to ask the critical question, to start building out a framework that is unique to your particular region or city. And so as Andrew's already shown, there's 4 quadrants here of the ecological, social, local, global. And really asking sort of what would it be for the people in Nanaimo to thrive? What would it mean for Nanaimo to thrive within its natural habitat? And then the global questions of what would it mean to respect the health of the whole planet? And what would it mean for Nanaimo to respect the well-being of people worldwide? So because of the compressed timelines, and our council had asked staff to integrate the Doughnut model into the official community plan process that was already, in a 3-4 stage process, had already done stage 1 of an extensive community engagement. We had to use the input that we'd already received from the community, which really did address the majority of these questions in the next stage of actually developing a framework, which will go back out to the community for more input. So in our official community plan update, we are updating our parks and recreational cultural plan, our sustainability climate action plan, our active transportation plan, our community economic development strategy, and our water supply strategy. And so having a unifying framework is really going to allow us to develop indicators and targets across the different plans and make sure that all elements are aligned so that none of our policies are working against the others. So a critical aspect of the Doughnut model is to have targets and indicators to be able to assess how progress of the community and be able to communicate that very clearly and be used as a tool to evaluate different policies. And so we had a large workshop online using a Miro, which is a great tool to discuss what are the goals and the targets and how we're going to measure them for the community across the different aspects of the Doughnut. And that produced a set of indicators. So basically in the Nanaimo City model, which we're using a model from Cornwall that adopted the Doughnut, and it's been a good model and platform to use. We have a set of ecological indicators representing the ecological ceiling, and then a set of social foundation indicators that are in 4 categories of healthy, connected, empowered, and enabled. So with our ecological ceiling, our top indicators and targets are GHG emissions, protected environmentally sensitive areas, surface water quality, collected waste in household, and water consumption. And in a lot of these indicators, we have targets already associated with them. A year ago, our council passed a climate emergency, and we set a community target to meet what our emissions targets would be to do our fair share of keeping the global emissions below 1.5 degrees Celsius as per the IPCC. Also, for example, with waste, we've set as a regional district, a target of diverting 90% of our waste from landfill. So that's bringing our per capita consumption from, I think, 350 kilograms of waste down to 109 kilograms of waste. And so these are the targets that are informing our ecological ceiling. And then within the social foundations, within each of those key headings of healthy, enabled, empowered, and connected, we have a set of different indicators, which are things that we can measure as a city that are within our realm of jurisdiction to control. And I think that was a criteria that our staff really would like. And there's a bit of tension between what our council's expectations are and what staff are able to do within our current resources and capacities within this OCP update. But for example, with homelessness, we had completed a large review and strategy to eliminate homelessness and improve housing affordability. And within there, there's set targets that we've integrated into our plan. So with now we have established a set of indicators, and there's a few that are up for debate, and we're noticing that it's going to have to be a bit of an iterative process as we go through our official community plan update and looking at the different land use scenarios. We'll go back and also inform what our targets are going to be. But one interesting conversation came up within the enabled section around business prosperity, and staff wanted to choose an indicator of business growth. And it was somewhat vague of exactly what that was, and we didn't know if it was sort of some type of GDP measurement that was sort of brought everything together. And so council has given direction that, instead of business growth, we really need to be thinking about a resilient local economy and looking at maybe a more diversified and balanced of sectors across across industry and our commercial endeavors, and figure out a measure in there. And so there are some indicators and measures that we're going to have to maybe do a bit more research and develop ourselves. So where we're at right now in terms of the application, we do have a rough set of indicators and a draft Doughnut model, and we're basically using that with all the indicators to evaluate our different land use scenarios. So we just had a recent workshop where staff have set up 3 different models of what our city could look like. One was the status quo, one was concentrating growth in certain nodes, and then one was even focusing on just concentrating growth in the downtown. And we evaluate it based on GHG emissions, how it would affect affordability and homelessness, how it would affect connectivity in terms of active transportation and trip use in vehicles. And we're going to be communicating that evaluation to the community, putting those scenarios out and receiving feedback on that. So not only is land use planning how we're applying the donut, but we're also going to be using that as an evaluative tool in our annual budgeting process, so that when our budgeting decisions come forward and staff bring forward business plans for increasing staffing levels in certain areas or different capital projects, all those decisions will be evaluated and demonstrating how they perform within our city's donut model, both on the social indicators and ecological indicators. Another aspect where we're applying it, where we have control, is our procurement policy, and we'll be using the donut and the different objectives within our community donut to evaluate how we're providing contracts and what our procurement will be like. So that's some examples of where we're at in Nanaimo in terms of the application of this concept, and it's a very creative process, and staff have been extremely engaged, and so is the community. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions later on. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Really good to sort of see how this lands on the ground, and particularly that focus around metrics. I know that a lot of folks in the Victoria region have been working around trying to bring a little bit more of an ecological and social lens to the metrics. And a lot of how we do what we do is about what questions we're asking when we develop the policy and when we report out on the results. So that critical focus on metrics is important. And so now we're moving into questions. There's been quite a few comments in the chat, and I'm not going to be able to address the comments very thoroughly because there's so many, but we are going to be capturing the chat and we will do a write-up afterwards. But certainly a bunch of the comments are focusing on the sort of conflict between GDP and as a measure of our economy and being able to achieve the donut. And so questions around sort of the missing investment in arts and culture and connectivity, and what Julia was saying of being able to bring people together and connectedness. If we're not valuing that in our models, how do we value that or push that forward? So this tension, we're seeing that in the chat a lot, this tension between how we measure our economy in terms of GDP and being able to do the donut. And maybe that's the first place to sort of launch in, is how fundamentally do we need to change what we're measuring in terms of our economic growth and the model we use to be able to do a donut. Do you want to start, Andrew?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Am I muted? No. I'll jump in on that. That's a wonderful question. And that really cuts to the core, of course, on, I almost see it as like a spectrum in terms of like, what types of questions do we need to be asking, as you just said, but as well, the paradigm that we're holding when we approach our vision of prosperity on one side, and then on the other side, of course, is the actual metrics and what indicators, what the results come out the other side, and in between, of course, there's many different steps in terms of models, in terms of indicators, in terms of choices, who picks it up, etc. But I wanted to share, I think it was great that actually, can I share my screen very quickly to touch on a point that. So you should be able to see that again, which should just be a yellow screen. Sorry about that. It's just touching a little bit on the side that Councillor Jesselbrack showed at the end. And it's asking essentially to touch on the GDP side. It's in the 20th century, really, we were faced with this question of how can we make our city grow? And GDP was the classic metric for that. And what we're arguing with the donut is the question becomes, how can we make our city thrive? Now, of course, it's the case, I saw in the chat as well, that we can expect that populations are going to be growing, but the purpose of our city, our objective is not to serve growth, it's to serve thriving. So at Deal, we don't actually offer a set of policies that can achieve that, because of course context change and everything. So what we offer is this framework for thinking about different forms of how we can come to grips with whether our activities, or in this case purpose, our networks, our governance, our ownership, and our finance are aligned in service to thriving, or if they're malaligned in service to growth. And so this is just a very quick way that we've been thinking about it, and touching upon as well Ben's point on what powers does a city have to act. I think it's such an important question, right? Because we're all embedded in our place, but our place is often within a province or a state, which has a national context, which has an international context. And it's worth considering, how do each of these, key design traits, how are they in service to thriving, as we say? So I'll leave it there as how we try to grapple with moving from the GDP question to thriving in balance.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Yeah,
Julia?
happy to just to embellish on what Andrew just said. Cities and places don't generally track GDP. It's a national government obsession, essentially. And it doesn't mean anything to people, like apart from, yes, okay, our economy is going up or economy is going down. And what the portrait essentially does is create a dialogue to understand what the priorities around thriving is for the people. Then you can land on alternative metrics that are meaningful to the people, that are aligned with what prosperity means in this new context. So, I mean, I totally appreciate that, yes, we need to get rid of GDP. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But we need to go through a process of understanding what the alternative to GDP is. You can't just get rid of it. You need to replace it with something that guides policy making, decision making, and indeed how we live our lives. And I think the thing is that we've just been beholden to it as this one ultimate indicator. And it's not as simple as to say that it will be replaced with another one indicator. It will probably be a dashboard of indicators that are important to the place. So that's, again, we're working with cities. And I imagine Ben's probably thought through this a number of times already, is that, what those indicators are is going to probably be slightly different for every different place, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and one of the questions that this stemmed from was focusing, Claire Atwell focusing on sort of our lack of valuing of things like the arts and culture and social connectedness. We saw fairly recently that, and certainly through the pandemic, like you mentioned, that for seniors and in particular, that social connectedness is a key determinant of health, higher than smoking, for example, as a determinant of health. So it's great to sort of engage in how do we shift what we're valuing. And I think that metrics conversation, Ben might be able to speak to this, of how effectively that's able to shift us away from economic growth into how much we're really relying on other measures.
For sure. I think, what your goal is reflected in how you're measuring your success. And that's, we're going to shift it from GDP to something a bit more broad. And we're trying at our city to develop a dashboard of the different and holistic measures that show that we're moving towards being a thriving city. And so, specifically with parks and art and culture, there's a discussion on what exactly would be the best indicators for that. And right now we're looking at an indicator on the investment in arts and culture and heritage. Another indicator is participation in our parks, recreation, and culture programs. And then one that's important to everyone, which we haven't figured out exactly the best way to measure, is some measure around inclusion and diversity. And I think what's really critical is that as we shift the goal of what we're trying to achieve, we're going to have to build out our measurement infrastructure and capacity, at the municipal level of what are we tracking, and the people who are tracking it, and the reporting on that, so that we're continually informing ourselves. And I think this is a bit of the shift to outcomes-based budgeting, of just shooting for our goals. And I'm a big fan of that book. I think it's Moonshot, or by Mariana Mazzucato, but I think that really encapsulates the vision of how governments need to operate now.
Great, and that inclusion and diversity issues come up a few times in the chat as well, with folks asking how do we ensure, and I think, you know, for example, today's conversation, you know, with so many more people than we anticipated, which is fantastic. This is great appetite for this conversation. The need to do smaller breakouts, have more inclusion, and certainly engage with our Indigenous community partners and other diversity partners around what measures, what should be measured, and ensuring that we're measuring what matters from all sorts of different perspectives. And then that's an inclusive conversation, so that you only get inclusive metrics if you have an inclusive conversation. And so certainly when we talk about the next steps at the end of today, that we'll make sure we circle back to how do we ensure that this is an inclusive and engaged conversation at the grassroots level, really talking about measuring what matters. And then another question that was asked, there was somebody, David Thompson, who was concerned with the possibility that the donut can be misinterpreted, where there's a sense that that there's a ceiling to the social. So there's a bottom to the social on the inside of the donut, but that the social and the ecological come into conflict at some point. And so I don't think that's what's intended by the donut economics model, but it can be seen a little bit that way, that you know, there's a long tradition of jobs versus the economy, and you know, sort of divide and conquer between social and environmental movements and organizations. So how do you ensure that the donut is really inclusive in that perspective, and that we don't see any kind of sort of conflict between the social and the environmental? Julia.
It's not really a dichotomy. I think it's one of those things that essentially our economy needs to be serving the people. Right at the moment, it's serving economic growth, which is profit driven more than so a few very wealthy people are benefiting, and that concentration of wealth happens at that level. If we actually pivoted our economies to be fostering thriving for all people, then we can still continue to go in the direction of economic growth per se, or economic prosperity, I prefer, but it would be around thriving and equity. So rather than see it as a sort of like, well, it's got to be one or the other, if we create jobs that are meaningful, family sustaining, but also producing the goods and services that we need to thrive in the 21st century. Right at the moment, there's a plethora of goods and services that are just meaningless and will land up in landfill. That stuff needs to just go. And it's not as easy as saying, oh, we're going to ban it. I think someone suggested that we tax advertising or something like that. It's really difficult to go to those policies straight away. But moving to sort of incentivize advertising, or making it cheaper to advertise goods and services that are good for us, and taxing or making it way more expensive to advertise the goods and services that are causing harm, whether it be socially or ecologically. And I think France is actually looking at those kinds of policies where you're actually not necessarily banning advertising or taxing sugar or fat, for example, but really starting to create the embedded incentives to move in the direction where economy is for the people. And then on the inclusive stuff, I agree, it is a challenge for all cities to be inclusive and equitable in how they have this really rich conversation with people. But a term that we're using together with Kate and Doughnut Economics is change makers. So to go where the energy is, there will be those people that actually recognize the need to change, and fostering and working with those people, acknowledging that you need the key people that have power and influence as well, is an important starting point. And then just making sure that the most vulnerable people are also included. But it's not absolutely everyone, because we wouldn't be able to do it feasibly. But yeah, so I just wanted to add those points.
On that note, it's funny that you mentioned the sugar drinks, because Newfoundland and Labrador has just implemented a sugar drinks tax at the same time as implementing new taxes on higher income. So we are starting to see, now that's at the provincial level, and you know, the conversation today is a little bit more municipal focused, but there is and Sustainable Prosperity Canadian organization's done a lot of work on tax shifting around environmental. I think that there's a need to really, the donut maybe gives us an opportunity to take some of that good environmental work that's done around tax shifting, particularly at the municipal level, and start to look at ways we can do that to make municipalities more progressive. I can share a link in of a report that I've done previously looking at how municipal taxes and revenue generation can be made more progressive so that we're redistributing income within a municipal context as well as provincial and federal tax contexts. Does anybody want to add?
I mean, sorry, I just have a quick comment. I mean, I think that that conflict between jobs and environment exists, and if we're trying to get into the donut, and we're seeing it play out with old growth deforestation, and right now we have a forestry sector that is dependent on a practice that is exceeding environmental limits, and I think that we can relieve that conflict if everyone can trust that in these situations that governments at all levels are willing to invest and partner and take a leadership role in developing the economy that we need to develop. And I think that that's what the big call on is right now, is for municipalities, the province, and the national federal government to look at more partnership with private business, but setting the vision towards getting inside that donut. And that's, I think, the task that's ahead of us.
Andrew, did you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just a couple quick thoughts, essentially echoing what Councillor Jesselberg just said with respect to, I mean, from Doughnut Economics Action Lab, our vision of the economy essentially places, of course, the economy is a social construct, it's part of society, and society in turn is part of the earth system. And so we're fundamentally dependent on the earth system for all of our materials and for assimilating all of our waste. So that's a reality, but at the same time, there's space in which to achieve our prosperity without bumping into the limits of a finite planet. And so far, I mean, based on the donut, based on empirical research, quite a bit of evidence suggests, especially in places like Canada and high consuming nations, we're significantly overstepping our resource consumption, our CO2 emissions. And I guess I had to respectfully disagree a little bit in terms of the rate of decoupling that's being observed being sufficient to actually avoid climate and ecological breakdown. It's just empirical. It hasn't been observed. And so it's essentially nobody knows the future, but in terms of risk, there's more or less risky approaches. And I think that I saw in the chat as well, being more shifting the goals away from growth rather than aiming to decouple our environmental impact from growth. Well, I would take the former, and yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. We have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to just combine a couple of questions. There are some specific questions for some of the speakers in here, particularly Ben, around implementation that I think we'll leave for the breakout. Like I said, we'll be taking notes and sharing that with folks, so you won't miss out too much. But in sort of terms of general questions, one of them is with regards to smaller municipalities, particularly sort of northern and remote municipalities. How do you implement the donut? Other limitations on how small a municipality can be in a region, and remote to implement the donut effectively is one of the questions. And then the final one, we can have everybody kind of address these at the same time, is we've got a lot of frameworks. So there's the SDGs, One Planet, the One Planet model is fantastic around social and environmental metrics, circular economy. We've got a lot of frameworks. So this is a new framework. Where's the sense of urgency we need for action, and how do we move from, I mean, this is a fantastic framework and it helps to really bring this conversation together and supports the other frameworks and the other implementation models. But where's that urgency? How do we actually move to action? Julia, do you want to start?
I can. I mean, I think the urgency in our cities is paramount. They recognize the need and they have C40 pushing them all the time. The real challenge with that urgency thing is that, as we've just been talking about, is to make sure that we're creating jobs that are good jobs, and creating and pivoting our whole entire economies to local sustainable economies actually takes quite thoughtful, careful consideration. And what I'm seeing right at the moment is the rub in cities to do the more immediate things of just returning back to normal. It's quicker and easier to do a policy that you know and you recognize that will generate a job right now. And it is actually more challenging politically, but also policy-wise, to create more careful, thoughtful policies that will transform and pivot the city to this new direction. So what we ultimately need is community support for this, because political leaders that have subscribed to climate change and social equity and all those things, they really want to do it, but the pushback that they get indeed from business and indeed their communities wanting immediate action or like do the change now is a rub. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I think, yeah, we do need, and as Andrew's saying, like the decoupling is not enough, and the urgency, as I articulated in my presentation, is absolutely there. But we sort of need to run slowly together. I think there's an African proverb that I'm trying to quote now. It's just like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So we need to do the collaborative process. We need to bring people, both business and communities, along the journey so that they support the transformation. It will be disruptive. It won't always be pleasant. So we need that support for the mandate for urgent transformational change.
Andrew?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think there's, of course, any single answer, but if we're speaking of the urgency, how we at Doughnut Economics Action Lab see ourselves is as one part of a wide movement of change makers, as Julia mentioned, who are all pushing towards the same goal, essentially, of a people and planet thriving in balance, whether it's One Planet Initiative or all the other wonderful things that we all know exist. So the way that we work is by trying to engage at three levels. One is at the level of, at the narrative level. We aim to reframe economic narratives by engaging in high-level events that, because of Kate Raworth's essentially tireless crusade over the past years and her wonderful book, we are having influence amongst, some influential people and organizations, from Sir David Attenborough to the Pope to the World Economic Forum. Another level is engaging in strategic kind of high policy, high leverage interventions within the incumbent regime, if you will. So at this point, we really just try to, we listen to what is being asked. Oftentimes it's organized by people who are organizing and changing from within the organization or within their place. And oftentimes those people are not visible. So we aim to just, if there's a place to show up and follow the lead, and I would consider this is almost the first steps towards that, where then that's a role for us. But one of our main areas is, as Julia mentioned, around going where the energy is, trying to make visible those innovators and those people who are already in action, the energy that's already out there, but just needs to be brought together. And we try to connect that. And that's where a lot of our energy goes as well. While recognizing that there's absolutely a role for those who are standing against the incumbent regime, who are, putting their lives and their bodies on the line. We support them in initiatives that make sense as well, like Extinction Rebellion, like many others. So I just see it as kind of a big network of everyone pushing towards the same goal, and hopefully we get to the critical mass of the change that's needed in this pivotal decade.
Great, thanks. We are just at time. Ben, did you want to add anything last quick comment for those two questions?
I think educating as best as possible the urgency and building the coalition of the willing, and it's an art form, but there's a lot of examples of micro urgency with the homelessness situation that people are experiencing, and we just have to keep bringing that back to the big picture.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very wonderful conversation to have. Really exciting to be engaging at this level, and lots of great comments in the chat and questions. We haven't gotten to them all, but hopefully those questions can be circled back to during the breakouts. And Michaela's just going to give folks some quick instructions on breaking out to our workshop rooms.